Hi, everyone. This is Christine Livingston. I am the Chief Strategist for Artificial Intelligence at Perficient. I'm here to talk to you today a little bit about what we've learned in healthcare consumerism. And joining me is David Allen.
Hi there, David Allen. I'm a director in our healthcare practice, and I lead up our strategy work around digital health and virtual health. We're going to spend some time here today just talking through high-level messages on and findings that we have in terms of strategic considerations for AI in healthcare, and then we're going to dive into a bit of detail around machine learning, natural language processing, and cognitive computing in the context of virtual agents.
Thanks, David. So I don't think this is anything new to anyone attending this conference, but we have seen artificial intelligence adoption triple in the past 3 years. So it's really been explosive growth, and we really think we're still just getting started. And, there's quite a few trends that we've seen in many different industries that are mirrored in healthcare. So some cross-industry trends that we see are, again, data is increasing at a tremendous volume and velocity. And so many companies and many industries are struggling with ongoing data quality and data scale challenges as they experience data like it's never existed before. Consumer expectations are at an all-time high, looking for that personalized, high-touch, very easy, simple to use, frictionless experience. And self-service is an absolute table stake expectation now. So being able to support your engagement in the channel that someone prefers at the time that's convenient for them is really necessary to even remain competitive. And we're seeing a trend of starting to approach emerging technology a little bit more thoughtfully and intelligently. So rather than just checking the box of deploying AI or deploying RPA, you're trying to actually embrace the technology, leveraging it in a meaningful. Some of those mirrored in healthcare as well.
Absolutely. So I think there's a recognition that the strategic rationales for AI in healthcare, there's a lot of excitement and interest, but I think a lot of education still happening in the industry in terms of the roles and scope and strengths of AI, but also on the major dependencies that can be challenging in the healthcare space. One of the main ones that we'll spend some time talking about in a moment is in terms of data and analytics maturity and the challenges that we have in healthcare with the huge amounts of data that we have, and the ability to collaborate both inside of organizations and across entities, which have not always been as straightforward as we would all want them to be, and are in part exposed in things like the COVID-19 situation. But then I think the focus of this session is going to be tightening down on personalization and self-service in healthcare, where I think like we said, the role that the AI has to play in personalization, and in particular the role that self-service has to play in enabling personalization, enabling actual personalized experiences in the healthcare space, are big focus areas that we want to share some perspective on. Right. So as we go into this session, we want to kind of raise two fundamental AI strategy considerations that we think apply across industries, but in particular in healthcare. One is that message that we typically recommend having a enterprise strategy perspective on AI. So healthcare has a track record in general of having that shiny object syndrome kind of situation play out, and really kind of taking things in silos and innovating incrementally. And we think that especially when we get down into the weeds of talking around virtual agents, there are some significant advantages to approaching this with an enterprise strategy in mind from the get-go. Similarly, that conversation around data analytics maturity, which Christine will talk about in a moment as we get into machine learning, recognizing that to an extent, the pace of digital innovation, not just in AI, but across the board in healthcare, is increasingly determined by an organization's underlying data and analytics maturity. So we'll spend a bit of time talking about that as well. I'm going to jump forward here Christine, do you want to tell us a little bit about the building blocks here?
Sure. So I think artificial intelligence is still, years later, a really broad term. We like to think of AI as really being many different building blocks or capabilities that you can construct and leverage throughout your organization to create intelligent applications. So broadly classified, you have things that fall in the data science or machine learning spectrum, where you're doing optimization, prediction. A lot of machine learning falls in this space. Natural language processing starts to build on some of those ML concepts and is typically used for things like entity extraction or classification. This is really the field focused on understanding unstructured text and taking into account context and syntax to make sense of things. Then you've got speech and vision capabilities, which are fairly self-explanatory. And you've got then cognitive solutions, which are taking machine learning, natural language processing, and it's adding some level of hypothesis evaluation and decisioning. This is where you have solutions like next best action or decision support systems or intelligent virtual agents. And as we look at the trends of healthcare consumerism, we really think data science or machine learning, NLP, and virtual agents are areas that should really be focused on within the healthcare space. And we're seeing a lot of traction in this industry. Particularly as we, think about maturity, and as you think about progressing really through the analytics maturity continuum, you start to think about the data progressing to very descriptive reports, understanding what happened, and then moving towards that more predictive and prescriptive side of the spectrum of analytics. But they're all dependent on the state before, right? So you need your purest cleansed data. You need to be able to understand that at a very descriptive level. And as you start to build out those foundational elements, we're starting to move into this predictive and prescriptive landscape. And particularly when you look at things like optimization and predictions, this is where machine learning is really making an impact, starting to understand what's the best thing that might happen, what's the optimal outcome when you have competing factors and priorities, as well as interpreting what may happen in the future. And not all machine learning is created equal. There are many different types of machine learning. Again, still a pretty broad term. You can think about high level, unsupervised, supervised, reinforcement learning. There's also transfer learning. There's a lot of different fields of machine learning that all should be used for their appropriate use cases. And there's different implications of all of the above. So there's a lot of excitement around unsupervised learning, which is this notion of I'm just going to throw a bunch of data at my model and it is going to draw conclusions and provide to my data. There's still a lot of value, however, in the more traditional supervised learning model, which is where, exactly like it sounds, humans are providing labeled inputs and they're supervising the model's learning process to draw conclusions at a larger scale. And when we really look at the types of machine learning that have delivered meaningful value, the vast majority fall in that supervised learning space. And as you start to think about some of those applications in healthcare, David will give some perspective on where we've seen this applied.
Yeah, and I think this applies across the payer, provider, and pharma life sciences spaces in general. But a couple of big ones those use cases on the top left in terms of segmentation and prioritization, and then within the payer space, understanding and driving risk stratification across types of members. It's a key use case for machine learning. You've talked about predicting outcomes being a challenge, but also being able to predict specific events, so being able to track things like readmissions, which we're going to talk about in a moment, and being able to understand where we're likely to see some of those activities. And I think one of the challenges that we're also going to talk about is that in healthcare in particular, we have a richness of data that allows for a lot of promise for machine learning, but it often takes a fairly substantial amount of data cleansing and data work to get to usable sources. That's a key piece. Personally, I'm very excited about the top right on there in terms of the use case for incorporating wearable data, though I think we're just getting started in terms of bringing those tools into machine learning from what we're seeing in the marketplace. Just because we've got a lot to cover, I'm going to suggest we jump forward to the case study here. Christine, if you want to tell us a bit about what we did here.
Sure. So we worked with TriHealth a few years ago to help them identify and interpret readmission risk. So as patients were admitted to the emergency department, they were trying to understand at that moment who was most likely to return. And not only who was most likely to return, but why would they return? So we were able to work with them to build a modern data science platform and ultimately increase their prediction accuracy of readmits to 93%. So a 52% improvement over the model and the statistical model they had in place prior to this particular execution. And we were able to help them optimize their resource deployment as well as identify those top drivers for readmission, which could help prevent that future readmission.
What were some of those data challenges in particular that you were talking about?
So I think one of the interesting challenges that we saw here was, we started by using the data available to us, which was all structured information, everything that you would check off on a form, the intake information that you would provide. And we found that it helped. It got us to about a 71% accuracy rate, but it wasn't enough to get us across that finish line, right, to really have a meaningful, reliable model. And so we started to look at alternative data sources and actually ended up mining through physician notes, so leveraging their unstructured data, applying some natural language processing to surface key features and indicators that we're able to incorporate in that predictive model to ultimately improve our overall accuracy to about 93%. So able to identify that we didn't have sufficient data in simple structured format and look outside of that expected ecosystem to identify new meaningful data sources to really drive us forward. And I think as we then look at our second space in natural language processing, again, another really interesting key area for exploration and development in healthcare. This is, again, the field of understanding unstructured information. So this is where context matters, and the specific words that are used can often be largely irrelevant, right? So this is not keyword searching. It's not looking for specific words in a certain sequence or order, but it's really understanding the nuance of the unstructured way that people communicate. So when someone says break a leg, right, in the left example, this is an actual literal broken leg. In the right example, we're talking about having a great show and a great performance. And natural language processing seeks to take into account the context in which specific words are used to draw meaningful conclusions. So some of the common ways that we see NLP applied is in text classification, so starting to do logical groupings, entity extraction, natural language generation, sentiment analysis, very simple question answer systems, think FAQ style chatbots, and in language translation. I think the area where we've seen the most opportunity in health sciences is with entity extraction, that transformation of unstructured data to structured data elements. And medical terminology is particularly complex, right? The specific order of words is very important. Understanding whether something is a precondition, understanding whether that was my health history, my family history, all of that context is critically important to understanding the content itself. And the goal of NLP becomes this notion often of entity extraction. So how can I create this medical translation service where I can read information and I can draw meaningful conclusions out of it? What were the actual procedures performed? Who was it performed on? What medication was prescribed? And we can draw these discrete data elements out of a larger narrative to create actionable insights.
Right. So you can think about a lot of different use cases for this, obviously, in healthcare. pure medical terminology related, obviously, in terms of things like disease state identification, but also more kind of specific business use cases like prior authorizations in the payer space. And also, I think you talk a little bit in other scenarios around review and sentiment analysis being a really kind of interesting space for consumerism in healthcare as well. I think we're going to talk about a payer example next here, and maybe if we dive into that and think about, just going to jump ahead a little bit in terms of the focus for this one that we've talked about. Thinking about how you design to support scale, because obviously a lot of these initiatives start at a fairly discrete level. So how do you think about that enterprise scale? And maybe just give a bit of background on this, but share that as well.
Sure. So this particular client we were working with, they had tried to implement and had successfully implemented their first AI capability, but quickly realized that it didn't scale to the second use case. And so when we started working with them, we all agreed to take a step back to work first on their strategy to understand their North Star. Where were they headed? What were they trying to accomplish? And then how could we build discrete capability models that enabled that long-term vision? So as they were working towards the long-term vision of providing self-service for questions like, how much will my knee replacement cost me? We broke that down into individual capability models, or NLP models, that were able to first expose information to their contact center agents, providing a natural language search interface for benefits and coverage inquiries. So we were able to ultimately translate and normalize some of those terminology and concepts that exist in a plan document and make them simple and intuitive for the contact center agents, and built out their first 3 NLP capability models that are part of the long-term vision towards that true self-service state that we'll get to with the cognitive self-service agent, as we'll talk about in our next section.
Yeah, these things kind of build on each other, right? So you have to do some of that work on the machine learning side to be able to enable some of these pieces, which in turn enable some of the use cases that we're going to talk about in the next one. And I think what we want folks to take away from the next section that we go into on virtual agents is how that ties back to this message of, you have to have an enterprise strategy perspective for this to really kind of get the benefit and scale from AI, and you have to have this perspective on data maturity. So just kind of reintroducing those two just before we go into the next section.
Absolutely. So some of my personal favorite space, cognitive computing and virtual agents, and where we see, again, a lot of opportunity is to meet these increasing expectations of consumer engagement. You can leverage artificial intelligence to make your engagements relevant, consistent, contextual, and timely, right? And you can do that at scale by leveraging artificial intelligence to make those engagements personal, specific, available across many different channels, and again, available at any point that I may look for that engagement. We see conversational AI as the cornerstone of creating this consistent AI-enabled experience. And if you think about conversational AI as being the intelligence that you infuse to your applications and your engagements with your consumers, you're able to focus on training the intelligence one time and scaling that across many different channels to many different constituents, while providing the intelligence at that core NLP and ML enabled layer of conversational AI that's connected one time to your different knowledge bases and sources of information. And as we think about really our strategy recommendation in this space, again, what's a chatbot, what's a personal assistant, what's a virtual agent, our recommendation is to think not about discrete chatbots that are task driven, but think about creating a conversational platform. Create that core in the conversational AI picture that allows you to scale your intelligence across many different use cases, many different channels, and will create that consistent experience. It also helps you simplify your training and your support efforts. You can simplify into one platform and train again for those NLP concepts or components one time and scale them to many different use cases. So really think about focusing on a conversational platform rather than creating discrete task-based chatbots.
And I think that helps to kind of set the context for this slide where we talk about some of the use cases in healthcare. And obviously, the top left of this slide are where a lot of the activity in digital in healthcare has been, in particular in terms of find a tools, find a doctor, find a location, etc. A lot of those self-service use cases are about these kind of very frequent high transaction interactions, and everything that you can do to make those more intuitive through using a effectively set up virtual agent really accelerates this. And I think what we're also seeing is that these tools are increasingly important as part of the next generation of virtual health in terms of digital therapeutics, care coordination, those kinds of use cases for healthcare, where you're again, especially from a member and patient perspective, and this applies in the pharma and life sciences space as well, you're trying to get across and get some fairly complicated journeys across to patients, members, users of your product, to get some pretty specific information pretty quickly. And I think hopefully what our goal of setting these out was to see that you need to set that foundational strategy, not just in the context of virtual agents, but in the context of machine learning, in the context of NLP, and think about those two themes that we were talking about right from the get-go to drive this. All of these use cases depend on that, and are likely to be more successful if you have that enterprise strategy perspective, and if you have that kind of focus on being realistic about data and analytics maturity. So I think we're ready to kind of sum up here, Christine, if we want to jump to the next case study briefly, and then we'll finish up.
Sure. So this was done on the payer side, where we were looking to create a solution for provider benefits verification. So we actually created a virtual agent that was fully integrated into the IVR to provide information on coverage for procedures. So Christine's calling in, she covered for an MRI, and we were able to fully automate that interaction, transcribing the procedures, and reduced overall their call time by about 63%. So really simplified the engagement with the providers themselves, and successfully answered the questions around benefits verification.
Right. So I think the provider experience, we're going to talk a little bit about the provider experience on that one, but I think we probably, in interest of time, we probably want to jump to close out here.
Yeah, so when we really start thinking about is, as David's been pulling this thread through the conversation, having your AI strategy is the most important element for success. And we like to think about thinking big, start small, act fast. And we see that there's some of these baseline elements that need to be in place to successfully adopt artificial intelligence. The first is having a strategy. Create a capability-driven strategy, have that executive leadership support rather than approaching artificial intelligence through ad hoc use cases, and make sure that you've sufficiently identified the business value associated with the capabilities that you're looking to drive and the use cases you're trying to support. Make sure that you have prioritized those use cases, broken them down into meaningful value units. And when you start to think about scale, again, rather than building for a single purpose or application, build your models as capabilities that can be reused and redeployed and scaled across different use cases and different elements of your organization. And then last but not least, make sure that you've thought through the skill sets available to you and the impact of deploying artificial intelligence on your workforce, right? So understand and embrace head on the different challenges, have an OCM strategy, and make sure that you have also selected tool sets that line up with the you have available to support your solutions. And when you think through the different, complexity factors, there's many. This is a roll up. But when you start to think about how do I know how complex a particular use case is and how do I start to prioritize them? Again, typically we're looking at the business value against the complexity to deploy. And for virtual agents, you can think about the number of intents and entities, the integrations you have to support, whether or not there's additional technology. On the ML side, it's really thinking through all the data elements. And for natural language processing, how many different elements are we looking to extract? What type of format is that information in? Is there any type of semi-structured or tabular information? Those are some of the key things to consider when evaluating the complexity of a deployment.
I'm sure there'll be a lot of questions around that slide. So if anyone ready to talk in that one in more detail.
Yes. And, you know, when you think about really then taking this to creating your roadmap, it's typically a process of, again, evaluation and prioritization. So understand the use cases you're trying to drive, break them down, score them, and then take them through a decomposition process. So start to look at the use cases that you're trying to enable and break them down into foundational capabilities. Again, those are those capability models that you can reuse, redeploy, and scale throughout your organization, and build each capability through a prove, deploy, iterate model. So build a capability at a time. Typically, we try to create about a quarter size deployment for each capability. And as you start to release a new capability, you'll increment on it, it will iterate, it will stabilize and get better. And you'll start to build up this library of capabilities enabling that enterprise transformation. And with that, we thank everyone for their time. Hope you found this information valuable, and I'll hand it to David to close.
Yeah, we look forward to the live questions, and hope we have time to cover as many of them as we can. So thank you very much.